The government wants to change negative gearing for property investors. Now, before you panic or even celebrate, let me go through what could actually happen to the property market if this does come into play, but also who it actually hurts. Now, the media is framing this as war between investors and first home buyers, but nobody's actually running the numbers or looking at the long-term effects of these policy changes. Hi, my name's Cory Harding and I'm founder of Prop7, where we're purchasing over $60 million per year in property in Adelaide, and I've watched governments try to fix the property market with multiple different schemes which only make matters worse for first home buyers. So in this video, I'm going to go through what could actually happen when and if the government caps negative gearing for property investors. We're also going to look at the dollar value impact of what this could do to the average property portfolio, why investors will most likely raise rents than sell, and why the government's track record of helping first home buyers is just going to make things worse. Starting with the real dollar impact of negative gearing capping. So right now, if you buy an investment property in your personal name and the property is actually producing less cash flow than what it's actually creating, in other words, you're negative per year, you can actually use that negative cash flow and claim it against your taxable income. This essentially just makes it a little bit easier to hold on to that property whilst it is in negative cash flow. The proposed changes that the federal government are looking to do in the next budget on the 12th of May is to either remove the negative gearing feature or cap it to up to 2 investment properties per person in their personal names. So let's look at the numbers that actually matter. So say you have a portfolio of 4 properties and each one is running at a $15K per year loss. Total of $60,000 per year in losses. Now, under the current rules, if you're at the top marginal rate of 47% in terms of tax, you get around about $28,200 back from the ATO across the 4 properties. So out of the $60,000 in losses, under the current rules with the ATO, if you're on the top marginal tax rate of 47%, you get around $28,200 back in tax time across the 4 properties. So your actual out-of-pocket expense per year for the 4 properties is $31,800 per year. Now, under the proposed changes, if they did go ahead and cap that to just 2 properties, your out-of-pocket expense goes from $31,800 per year to $45,900 per year. Now, that's another $14,000 per year in negative cash flow that you, the investor, would have to pay. But here's the thing that most people aren't even bringing up. The majority of the sophisticated investors, the ones that are buying more than 2, 3, 4, 5, even 10 to 15 properties, they're not really buying them in their own personal names. They're using structures such as companies and trusts. And the reason for that is they are typically running a business and they're not moving profits into their personal name to avoid the bigger tax rate. And so when you're buying a property within a structure, you don't get those negative gearing benefits. So if the goal here is to tax the rich are not really using these benefits. They're buying it in structures, and this effect doesn't really affect them at all. Now, the government's theory is that by making property more expensive for investors, investors will just sell up, flooding the market with new stock and driving prices down for first home buyers. But that assumes that investors behave the way a spreadsheet tells them to. And on the ground, that is not what happens, which is what I think will cause, which is point number 2, the lock-in effect. When you increase the expenses of an investment property, what do investors actually do? Some might stop buying new properties. A small percentage might sell up. But most who already own, they're just going to hold. And they're going to do one of 2 things. They're either going to hold the property, or they're going to notice that rents are going up because there's a lack of rental properties due to the lack of investors going in, and just raise their rents to match the market rate. And think about it. If you go out and buy investment property under this new policy where you don't get the negative gearing, you're going to have to increase the rent of that property just to hold on to it. And if you don't, then you can't afford the actual property itself or get the borrowing capacity to do so, which means there'll be less rentals on the market for renters. That is not greed, that's just basic economics. The cost of supplying a rental basically is going up. Now here is where it actually gets worse. This policy is most likely going to be grandfathered in, which means that anyone who bought a property prior to a certain date will not get affected by this change, and anyone that buys a property after a certain date will be under the new policy changes. Now, what does that do? I think that just permanently locks a certain amount of stock that will never go back on the market, because people will now see that property more valuable than the properties that they could buy due to the fact that they can claim the negative gearing on their income tax. Why would you sell that property and then go out and buy another property that doesn't have those benefits in place? You wouldn't, you would hold it forever. And we're already kind of seeing a version of this happen at the moment. Right now on the ground, a lot of people aren't even selling their home because they're struggling to find a home to buy into. We have such a lack of supply when it comes to the buying side. And I think these policies would just affect the rental market in the same way, but even worse. Because they can't find a house to buy into, they're just deciding not to sell. And that is why a lot of times I'm winning properties off market with conditions where they can actually rent the house until they find a new home, because they're struggling to find the home to move into for their growing family. And so similar to that, this is what's going to happen for the rentals. If less investors are going to the market, there's less rentals available to people who don't want to buy or can't buy yet, which will just raise rents due to the lack of supply. Which goes to the next point, which is the ripple effect of short-term policies. This brings us to the most important point of this podcast. It's the one that nobody is really talking about. The government has a long history of introducing policies that are meant to help certain demographics get into the property market, but actually just making things a whole lot worse. In other words, they're introducing policies that are targeting a certain demographic, but not actually seeing the ripple effect of how it actually affects the property market as a whole. And almost every time they do introduce a policy, the market just explodes and goes to the complete opposite angle that they intended to initially. Let's look back at their track record. Let's go back to 2021. This is the height of COVID. Now, when the property market, or the markets in general, were in a bit of a standstill due to all the lockdowns and everything, all the uncertainty that's happening in the market, the government introduced a $25,000 home builder grant that was designed to stimulate the economy and keep businesses open, keep the tradies and the construction companies working. Now, it did its job. The market exploded. Everyone had too much work. But what actually happened? Well, it created a massive artificial surge in demand into the property market. And supply chains couldn't even handle it. Building construction costs went through the roof. Construction times completely blew out. Construction companies, a few of them went bankrupt. And the cost to build a home surged. Back then, I was building a 3-bed, 2-bath, single-story home for $240,000. Now, it's very hard to get anything under $350,000. And with everything that's going to happen with the cost of materials and construction due to the war in Iran, we're going to see those costs blow out even more. Or let's have a look at the first home buyer guarantee for South Australians here. So back in 22, we used to have the cap of $550,000 and a $15,000 first home buyer grant. They upped it to $550 to $650, and they also removed stamp duty entirely. Then immediately, very quickly afterwards, they removed the purchase cap entirely, which meant that you could buy a brand new $3 million home and get the benefits plus pay no stamp duty. What did that do? The next week, pieces of land went up by $100,000 a piece on average. I know that because I was selling blocks of land at the time. So whilst it made it easier for first home buyers to get into the market, the savings that they had from no stamp duty was just placed on the purchase price of the property due to the surge in demand and a lack of supply in the market, making property even more unaffordable for first home buyers. Now let's go back to October last year. What was the big theme about the property market at the time? Was a lack of affordability and for first home buyers to get into the market. So they introduced a 5% no LMI scheme where you can purchase a property, in particular in Adelaide, up to $900,000 with a 5% deposit. Doesn't even have to be brand new. You just never have to buy a property before, and you can get in with a 5% no LMI. What did that do again? It massively increased demand and shortcut supply even further. Whilst it did help a bunch of people to get into the property, you're paying it in the purchase price, and now the effects have worn off and it's become even more unaffordable for first home buyers to get in. The economy doesn't work in a vacuum. It has a ripple effect. When you pull a lever to artificially suppress demand, something else will be affected, making prices either go through the roof and increasing unaffordability for others. Which then goes to my prediction: investors chase yields, affordable housing disappears. This is where, and this is my personal prediction, where things get even more scary. And to be honest, I haven't really heard anyone talk about it from this perspective. If negative gearing is capped, investors with tighter cash flow and reduced borrowing capacity will essentially be forced to go into even more affordable areas into the property market. In other words, they're looking for properties where they think they're going to grow and the yields are higher to make up for the reduced negative gearing benefits of the holding cost. In other words, the affordable areas, I think, could have an increase in demand, which will then make those affordable areas less affordable due to the spike in demand. I'm already seeing that at the moment. In Adelaide, 2-bedroom units or townhouses are absolutely going gangbusters right now, and super in demand and a lack of supply too. Massive growth in those things. And that's just the natural cycle of the property market. And so in other words, we're kind of already seeing that play out in the property market. And if this trend accelerates with these new policies, I think we're going to find that the affordable places in not just in Adelaide, but across Australia are going to grow quite a lot in the next coming years. And which leads to the final point is, who does this policy actually help and how does it help them? So if the negative gearing changes do go through and investors stop selling, which means a reduced supply, and new investors stop buying because the tax incentives are not there, making it very hard to hold on to the properties, who actually pays the price in all this scenario? Will this actually help first home buyers get into the market? And really, this isn't going to affect the current investors who own 3, 4, 5, 10 properties. It's most likely going to be grandfathered in. They're just going to hold on to their assets and watch the value grow. The people who pay the price for this policy are the renters. Private investors supply 9 of 10 rental properties on the market in Australia. If you disincentivize investors buying new property, the rental pool shrinks. Independent modeling by HIS shows that removing negative gearing could actually result in 46,000 less homes being built nationally. We already are way behind, and this is just going to make it. In Adelaide, our vacancy rate is sitting at 0.8%, critical levels for rentals. In some suburbs like Aberfoyle Park, we're sitting at 0.72%. Places like Redwood Park in the northeast are sitting at 0.54% vacancy rate. Nationally, we're sitting at 1.1% vacancy rate. If you choke off the supply of new investment properties, as well as new rental properties coming off the market, rents will spike. We know this because we ran this experiment back in 1985 with the Hawke government. They abolished negative gearing and they quickly reversed it back within 2 years due to the fact that rents rose by 30%. Now, this particularly happened in Sydney and Perth, where the vacancy rates were quite low, sitting at the low 1% mark. Their own cabinet papers confirmed that it wasn't the policy that affected rents, but the low vacancy rate in specific. Now, if it affected the states that had a vacancy rate of low ones, imagine what that's going to do to the states where the vacancy rate is actually under 1%. States like Queensland, Adelaide, Perth, even Sydney. For example, Adelaide's vacancy rate is way below what Sydney's was back in 1985. Less supply, same demand, and you know what that means. So the real lesson here is this. This doesn't really affect investors, well, current investors. And I think it's not going to really change investors in the future in terms of how they see property. Who it really affects is the renters. Because what you have to understand is that you will have a short-term effect of that policy, but the long-term, i.e. 3, 6, 12, 2, 3 year effect of this policy is when we really see the effects of this policy. And I reckon the people who are trying to rent and find affordable housing are the ones that are going to be hit the hardest, which is why you need to have the skill in knowing exactly where to buy, what to buy, that's going to help build your portfolio and your long-term growth. It's not like it was in the last 4 or 5 years where you can just buy anything and grow. You must understand the data and you must buy smartly, which is what we do every day at Prop Savvy. There'll be a link in the description below to book a call where we'll guide you through on how we're going to build your portfolio with the current and future policies taking in place that potentially may happen.